We shall start, yeah, Prof, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alamin. Wassalatu wassalamu ala ashrafil anbiya wal mursalin. Wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh to all of the participants. Yeah, welcome to our session. For an introduction, this is the second series on the conversations on the economy and jointly organized by the Department of Economics, Center for Islamic Economics, as well as Bachelor of Economics Student Council, under the Kuliah of Economics and Management Sciences, International Islamic University Malaysia, or widely known as IIUM. We're going to be focusing on I think most of those who have registered have known that this is actually a topic quite close to the hearts, yeah? So basically, the topic will be looking at COVID-19 policy response options, learning from the world. It is of our great pleasure today to have two prominent speakers, yeah? Tan Sri Rector, who has been able to join us, Alhamdulillah, as well as Prof. Jomo. So I think without further ado, I shall invite Tan Sri Rector, yeah, to basically deliver his opening remarks. Tafadhal mashkura, Tan Sri.
Thank you very much, Maya. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi taala wabarakatuh. And good afternoon. Professor Jomo, Professor Aslam, colleagues, students, brothers and sisters. I'm not a speaker. I'm here just to share your session. I thought this is a very timely session that we talk about something that all of us are now trying to understand, at least from my point of view, what this is all about. Everybody is talking about it, but not many people are making sense. So when Jomo is up here, I think this is someone that probably can point to certain directions that where we should go. Yeah, something that is close to my heart in the sense that I've got thousands of students to manage. For the first time, Jomo, I feel like a prison warden. You know, making sure that students move in and move out, they're all well looked after, and I think it's a big challenge for me. Although I was in USM for 10 years, but nothing of this nature. So academically, it's also very challenging. People are asking us, where do we go from now? Everybody says, go online, and we have a different thought altogether, because we know if we go online, there are many people who will not be getting the education that they want to do. So this is a struggle between us and the ministry to tell them, look, it is not as easy as that to put a solution to a problem that we hardly understand. Yeah. More so, this problem starts to me, it looks like a humanitarian problem. But towards the end, everybody is just talking about economics, and I don't know where the humanitarian issues are. Environmental issues has not been touched at all. The question of values are not there. And I was just talking to Maya and what you call Aslam. When you look at economics from Khaldun point of view, he talks about ethics, he talks about morality, he talks about all these intangible things that we have to touch in this whole discussion. So really this is a point to belabor. How do we equalize again? When we talk about, you know, what we call flattening the curve, there are many curves to flatten, I think. Educationally, I think we want to flatten the curve so that we can go back to the meaning of what education is all about: fair opportunity for everybody else, a leveler of society. People can start to move out from the level of poverty into something which is better. So I really look forward to this session, and I want to thank the organizer for inviting me to listen in. And certainly, Jomo, I think this is the closest that I get to you after a long time. So thank you very much. And I hope we can come up with a certain summary that the university is quite prepared to take on. If you think this is a policy direction, that the university will definitely want to champion this, because I don't think many universities are really into you know, seriously into where we are pointing. Most of my colleagues, when I ask them, what do we do next? Often the answer is we wait for the ministry. And I think we are not here to wait for the ministry. We want to to craft some, something that we think is useful, and if we need to champion it, we will do so. Yeah, so thank you very much, and Alhamdulillah to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that we are given this opportunity to meet, and hopefully this will be part of the barakah for the Ramadan. So on that note, thank you very much. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi ta'ala wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam. Thank you so much, Tan Sri, for being with us. So next, let us hear from Prof. Dr. Jomo. I think he's an economist, a prominent figure who needs no introduction. But just to state that he's also a visiting professor in our university, attached with the Department of Economics. Apart from that, he's also the senior advisor at the Khazanah Research Institute. I think the last time Prof. Jomo came to UIA was last year, if I'm not mistaken. He had the session in the LT1 in Kuliah Economy. Yeah, I'm not sure whether Tan Sri was there.
I was there.
Couldn't recall.
I was there. I remember that.
Right. So yes, let us welcome Prof. Jomo for him to deliver his talk on particularly the topic, and later we'll have a session on Q&A and things like that. Tafadhal mashkura, Prof. Jomo.
Thank you very much for those kind words of introduction, and thank you very much, Tan Sri Zul and Professor Aslam, besides Dr. Maya Puspa for chairing this session. Let me also thank the International Islamic University for kindly hosting this session. And I am, although I am an economist by training, Tan Sri Zul, I want to assure you that this will be one of my least economic presentations, perhaps ever. So let me first add my salams to the two previous speakers. I think it's very important that the concept of salam, of peace, also embraces security. There is no peace without security, and security embraces the notion of health, the concept of health. And I think this is extremely important because there are a lot of people who have taken a view that that somehow or other addressing the challenges posed by COVID-19 are somehow or other do not involve any Islamic guidance. We know from this that the Prophet himself, peace be upon him, was very cognizant of challenges of health and public health, and rulers in the Muslim world were pioneers in terms of introducing, for example, the concept of the quarantine, al-arbaya, which then got translated into quarantina in Italian, and when ships from the Muslim world visited Venice, and it became so it went to the Western world as quarantina, and quarantine, of course, in the English language. So there was very early recognition of the problems of infectious diseases, of contagious diseases. And this, I think, is extremely important. We see this, for example, captured in the writings in the Muqaddimah of Khaldun, as well as in very many other writings from well over 5 centuries ago. So this is important to reiterate because there are among people of faith a view that somehow or other this is God's will and that there is no human responsibility. As vicegerents of God, we have a responsibility to act, and to act with akal, with rationality in dealing with these problems. So what is COVID-19? COVID-19 refers to the infection, the disease, if you want to call it, which has been caused by what is now called the SARS-CoV-2 virus. SARS-CoV-2 virus, the reason the word SARS is there is because there are many symptoms similar to SARS-1, which happened almost 2 decades ago. In other words, it causes acute respiratory problems, And so people who are older people, people who have weak lungs because they're asthmatic and for various other reasons, people with pulmonary conditions are especially vulnerable to this virus. The virus is known now, is believed now to spread through 3 orifices of the face, the mouth, the nose, and the eyes, through the mucus of these 3 orifices. What distinguishes the virus is that it spreads through aerosol, so hence the need for physical distancing. I deliberately use the word physical distancing because social distancing is a pejorative term. It has been used since time immemorial to distinguish people by caste, by class, on various other grounds, including the whole notion of racial segregation. So the leadership of the government of Kerala in India, for example, insisted on using the word physical distancing. Many others have followed suit because it defies the whole notion of social distancing and what it entails historically. Now, what we find is that in many ways, the virus is far more infectious, partly because of its characteristics, than many of the recent viruses which have threatened human beings. But it is perhaps less deadly in the sense that those who are infected do not, a smaller proportion die from this. So I think it's very important to put this virus into perspective, put this pandemic into perspective, because there are a lot of myths about the pandemic, which has been exacerbated by some of the political rivalry which has emerged, particularly between the United States and Japan and its allies on the one hand, against China. So this has complicated, because of the kind of soft power the United States in particular enjoys. We have a tremendous influencing of the discourse around the virus due to the fact that there is a great deal of, noise, if you can put it that way, political noise due to the political conflicts and rivalry involved. As is well known, the virus attracted international attention from the Wuhan city. Wuhan city, for those who do not know, has long been the main industrial center of China. It has been known as the industrial center for decades, even before the Chinese Revolution in 1949. It's important. So it is, in a sense, the industrial hub, the industrial heartland of China. Of course, many people now know Shenzhen, but Wuhan has been historically extremely important. Wuhan is a large city, and many of the workers migrate on a daily basis, or rather, I should say, commute on a daily basis from around it. For many years, I lived in New York when I was working at the United Nations. And during this time, many staff came from outside of the city. They came from New York State, Long Island, and so on and so forth, or upstate New York. They also came from neighboring New Jersey, and as well as from neighboring Connecticut. And it was not uncommon for people to commute on a regular basis, on a daily basis even. Likewise, you have the same huge commuter traffic. So you might hear, for example, that 5 million people or 7 million people were released by China on the rest of the world. I think it's very important to recognize that, yes, there is a tremendous great deal of commuting taking place, but it's wrong to think that these people all were traveling all over the world on a daily basis. Yes, they were commuting, but and so it was. So the lockdown which the Chinese government imposed was imposed in three provinces. The three provinces, Hubei province, which is the province in which Wuhan city is located, as well as the other two adjoining provinces from where workers commute. So it's important to recognize that because there was some suppression by the local authorities in Wuhan of the first people who discovered, who suggested that there was a new epidemic, there was a new virus which was causing the problems. When this happened, it was suppressed by some of the local authorities who maybe they found it inconceivable, or maybe they're just averse to having any problems on their doorsteps, or for whatever reason, they suppressed this person who's now known as a whistleblower, and this was very, very unfortunate. When the national authorities in Beijing discovered this, they immediately took punitive action against the municipal authorities, and this doctor who first suggested that there was a new virus at work is been unfortunately posthumously celebrated as a hero for what he did. Now, because of this delay in recognizing that there was a new virus involved, and because of the delay in taking strong precautionary actions, effective precautionary actions, the virus spread. And so the Chinese authorities imposed a lockdown first on Wuhan city, and then when they realized the problems of the commuting workers, they imposed it on the neighboring provinces as well. This is important to emphasize because many people talk about the lockdown in China. In fact, in the remaining provinces in China, were 20 other provinces in China, there was no lockdown. Okay, this is important to recognize because many people think that a lockdown is the only way to deal with this problem. And this is why I asked to speak on what lessons can we learn from how other countries, other societies have dealt with this challenge. So what we find is that in the case of the other provinces, tremendous precautionary actions were taken. These precautionary actions involved many things, but it involved, among other things, identifying those people with certain symptoms and testing them. And in the case of identifying people who were tested positive, people who were considered infected, the presumption was that they were infectious as well. Okay, so they are capable of transmitting the infection. This is particularly challenging in the case of COVID-19 because there are two delays. Okay, the first delay is for about 5 days or so between being infected and having the body having enough antigens to be tested positive for tests of antigens. Okay, but tests for antigens tend to be rather expensive, and so many people have, many countries have adopted the much cheaper tests which are available for antibodies. But the antibodies emerge much later, and almost 2 weeks later. And so there can be a whole period of about almost 2 weeks when somebody who is infected and infectious is not identified as such. This is part of the reason why it is so difficult to deal with this problem. But it's important to recognize, as I said, that in the rest of China, there were there was no lockdown. except perhaps because those of you who know a little bit about China, Chinese workers have two major holidays every year. One is in the month of October, we sometimes call the Golden Month, and the other is around the Chinese New Year holiday. So you go home just before the Chinese New Year, you spend the time with your family and so on, and then you come back after 1 week. In this particular year, Chinese workers were asked to stay on at home for 2 weeks instead of 1 week. And that was so you might say that there was a sort of a partial lockdown, but that was basically what happened in the rest of China. So this is the lockdown, I want to emphasize, represents a failure of precautionary actions. Okay, if you take enough precautionary actions, you do not have to have a lockdown. Now, this it has bearing on many countries. In the case of Malaysia, for example, after the Chinese government, the new Wuhan municipal authorities reported the new virus to the WHO at the end of 2019, on the 31st of December 2019. The Chinese government informed not only the WHO, but also informed many others in the world, including the Malaysian government. And the Malaysian government, 3 days later or 4 days later, on the 3rd of January, actually announced that it was preparing for this new viral infection. Now, it is unclear what actually happened because there has been no full accounting for what happened. But one should remember that the Malaysian government had already been planning for many months to have a Visit Malaysia year during the year 2020. So preparations were all ready to go as far as this was concerned. And when there was suspicion that there was a virus infection, which possibly could come to Malaysia. But there were relatively few precautionary actions taken, and many would argue that although Malaysia was one of the countries in the region which have had experience with other viral epidemics, and just think, for example, those of you who are older, Malaysians who are older will remember that about 15 years ago, there was something called the Nipah virus. And the Nipah virus was named using a Malaysian plant. And of course, there was some pride attached to having this virus named after Malaysia. Now, there's been no recurrence since then, but in 2018, there was a Nipah virus outbreak in Kerala, and some Malaysians were involved in advising them. And part of the stellar response of the Kerala state government, outstanding by any standards, but certainly very different from the rest of the Indian response, is the fact that that Kerala had this experience. It has a very high literacy rate, a very high level of scientific consciousness, because as Tan Sri Zul knows, people like the late Haji Idris was very involved and active in promoting this notion of science for the people, of popular understanding of science, and so on and so forth. So all this was extremely important in terms of making Kerala better off. But let me come back to the situation in East Asia. So what is often said is that most viruses and most epidemics, viral epidemics, tend to begin from this part of the world. Now, why is this so? There's a lot of speculation and conjecture Everybody has their own favorite theory, especially in the age of internet. Everybody can express their views, and you have a few scientific terms thrown in. You sound slightly scientific, and people take you very seriously. And so there's a lot of misinformation out there. But what I think is very important for us to recognize is that it is said that the high population of bats in this region, and bats have something in themselves which prevent them from succumbing to viruses which they may be carrying with them. And there has been, for various reasons, which I won't get into right now, because of perhaps disruptions to ecology and so on and so forth, many animals have been displaced, and the consumption of captured animals is something which is appreciated in many societies. And so the likelihood of what are called zoonotic diseases, transmission of viruses or other infectious substances from animals to humans, is something which has gained greater attention in recent years. When I was working at the Food and Agriculture Organization, for instance, this was a very major concern. And one of the campaigns FAO was involved in was something called One Health. In other words, we don't think of the health of the human being as unconnected to the health of animals and other living beings. And this, I think, is quite important. I have sort of used that notion in my own efforts to try to promote better nutrition. And the whole idea of thinking about nutrition as interrelated, ecologically speaking, for example, soil nutrition affects plant nutrition, which in turn affects human nutrition, because we consume the plants and so on and so forth. So the interconnectedness of human life is one of the wonders of the world, and which we need to really begin to understand and appreciate a bit more. But as we also know, in recent years, there has been a great deal of recognition that epidemics, viral epidemics, are very much a part of contemporary modern life. In fact, I was in school in Penang, in a school called Penang Free School, and all the houses when I joined were named after Englishmen, except for one house which was called Wu Lien Teh House. Wu Lien Teh was a Penang-born doctor who was very outstanding. He came back to Penang but he was very active in campaigning against opium, because the British made a lot of money from the Strait settlements, in particular from the taxes they imposed on opium. So he was very active in the campaign against opium. The British colonial authorities prosecuted him, and although the prosecution was not successful, he was so embarrassed by the whole thing, he decided to leave. He was offered a job in China, and in China he was involved in fighting the plague, a plague transmitted by rodents in Manchuria, and he actually used the whole idea of wearing masks in dealing with the plague. So we have a lot of connections with the whole idea of mask wearing and so on and so forth. And this is very much in connection with the things we are going to be talking about today. Now, coming back to China, the next country where there was a very serious outbreak was the Republic of Korea, or South Korea as we know it. And much of the spread of the virus occurred in a city called Daegu, another industrial city. And in Daegu, it is now known and confirmed that much of the spreading of the infection was due to a secretive religious cult, a Christian cult which operated in Daegu, and they would have secret meetings or semi-secret meetings. I shouldn't give the impression that they were underground or anything like that, but they were quite secretive in their style of work and so on. And they would come together on a regular basis. And so the spread very much. So it's very important to recognize that what is often associated with the so-called Tabligh cluster in Malaysia actually had its precedence in Daegu. And very often many religious groups emphasize coming together and so on and so forth, and which is part of the problem in the case of this particular epidemic. So coming back to the whole question of Korea, what Korea did was remarkable. Even in Daegu, they did not impose a lockdown. What they did, what they emphasized a great deal of was test. So as Dato Dr. Musa Nordin has emphasized many a time, there are 3 T's: test, test, test. I would take a slightly different view. I would say there are 3 T's, but 1 I. And I think it's very important for us to do the testing, certainly, but it's also important for us to do the tracing because of the delay in the efficacy of the test. It is extremely important for us to be able to trace the people whom somebody who's infected may have come into contact with, because they can in turn communicate the infection to the others. And so testing has to be combined with tracing and of course with treatment as well. But the other element which is very important and brings us back to the notion of quarantining is the whole question of isolation. Once somebody is suspected of being infected, there is the practice now is to isolate those people, even because you cannot be sure that whether or not the person is infected until the tests are available, and even then there is often an interval between infection and testing positive, depending on the nature of the test. So it becomes all the more difficult. So what we find is that this testing and the Koreans have been quite incredible in terms of innovating the ways you can do testing. You can drive in and have your test done, and a variety of other means they have done. They've used a lot of modern technology. I think the ICT applications as far as testing and so on are concerned are probably the most, have greatly been advanced, and all in a very, very short period of time. So you can see how necessity has been the mother of invention, of innovation, and so on and so forth. And the Koreans have done a very good job at that. And of course, the Japanese and the Taiwanese have learned a great deal from them, and they have kept down the infection rate as well. Now, again, I want to emphasize, without a lockdown. The next case, I think, which is very important for us to learn from, I've already mentioned it, is the case of Korea. The reason I want to mention Korea, and this is especially important in speaking to the IIUM community, is the fact that many of many people in the community actually come from societies which are even poorer than Malaysia. And Kerala state is a very poor state. It has a very high level of literacy. It has had full literacy since before World War II. But at the same time, it is actually very poor. It has mainly been an agricultural state. Increasingly in recent years, they have been doing a lot of services, often the services online and so on and so forth. But it has really been very much an agricultural state. And they have also been because of the very high levels of educational achievement, Kerala was the state where many of our teachers, for example, if Tan Sri Zul will remember, my teachers in English medium schools, I had about 4 or 5 teachers in a relatively small school who were from Kerala. They were born in Kerala and they came over to teach mainly science subjects, and this was very important in our education and so on and so forth. So what has happened now is that workers are sought after in India, especially in the major administrative as well as commercial capitals. So you have a lot of Kerala people in places like Mumbai as well as in Delhi. But also in recent decades, many of them have gone to work in the Gulf. So you will find that very often you will find people from Kerala who are playing a very, very important role there in the Gulf states. Much of the, not just the backroom work, but even some of the front desk work in hotels and so on and so forth, have people from Kerala who are often well-spoken in the English language and so on and so forth. So you have a very high level of education, but you have a huge job problem. And the result has been a lot of migration. Now, as you all also know, unfortunately, the Gulf is not what it used to be. And there has been this war against Yemen in recent years. And there have also been other tensions in the Gulf region. And the result is that much of the tourism and many of the other services which had developed in the Gulf have basically suffered a setback. And so many of the Keralites, or they are Malayali people who speak a language called Malayalam, many of them have been have left the Gulf and gone back to Kerala. Some of them, or to other parts of India in some cases. And then when the Indian government imposed a lockdown, many of them lost jobs in places like Delhi and Mumbai. So many of them went back to Kerala, to their hometowns where the cost of living is much lower and so on and so forth. And so one of the big problems the state government of Kerala had to deal with is this reverse migration, not just of people with more money, but very importantly, people with possibly people who were infected. Now, some of the people, the first infection in all of India was also associated with somebody from Kerala who was studying in Wuhan, an engineering student, and had brought the virus back and infected other people in turn. So so Kerala, from the month of January itself, was already involved. But even before the first infection was identified, Kerala began to prepare itself for a possible infection. And they did so through various means, which are very difficult to summarize in detail. But let me just mention 2 things because I think they are extremely important and contrast with what has happened elsewhere. They paid a lot of attention to the people who are self-employed, as well as to casual labor. Okay, casual labor who are likely to lose their jobs as soon as there is an economic shock. And it was that, I think, which enabled the entire state of Kerala to mobilize. So you have full participation from people who appreciate the fact that even the people in very difficult straits are being taken care of by the state government. Now, of course, this government is not just any ordinary government. It's left of center government. The Kerala state is ruled by something called the Left Coalition, and the teacher, who is the Minister of Health, she was involved in dealing with the Nipah outbreak in 2018. So she had the experience of dealing with that, and she took a lot of precautionary measures. So, for example, a very simple thing which people in Kerala do, almost everybody, including very poor people, actually go around not wearing masks which they have bought. They take an old sari, cut it up, and tie as if they are wearing a purda, of course, almost half the population of Kerala in the north, in the Malabar district, are Muslims, and so they are not unfamiliar with wearing a purda and so on and so forth. So you find a great deal of quick, easy social adjustment, not requiring saris and so on. And now we know that the virus does not last very long on cloth. Now we know that it doesn't last very long on paper. It lasts much longer on a plastic surface. It lasts much longer on a metal surface. For days, it can last on a metal surface or a plastic surface, whereas it only lasts for a few minutes on cloth and so on. So actually, fortuitously, it turns out that the poor man's option is actually the best option. Rather than using a plastic mask or styrofoam mask, you actually use something else which is actually very affordable. So the idea of using washable cloth masks is something which all countries, especially countries with poor populations, should consider. We cannot expect relatively poorer people in any society, especially including Malaysian society, to go around to buy a mask which costs 2 ringgit or even 1 ringgit every day. You have to improvise. And in this case, we know that using such masks actually can be actually more effective, and it is in a sense renewable. Now, so I think
Prof?
Yes.
Prof. Jomo, yes.
Yes, thank you, Dato. Yes,
I just want to bring you back to because what we have heard so far is very enlightening in terms of the background of the virus, and a lot of countries that you have covered. But when you mentioned particularly on Kerala and things that have the government that have given assistance, that's basically, I would presume that's basically referring to the rules-based fiscal stimulus whereby they give some sort of target transfer to certain population in that particular country. So if I may bring you back to the economics perspectives in terms of, I know that you've mentioned earlier that this is going to be the least economic talk that you'll be giving, but because we have quite 1/3 of our participants are the students, so I might as well pull you back to the economics perspective, of which let's look into China again. When this thing happened, we basically realized that we have an over-reliance on China, because when China, what does the saying say? When China sneezes and the rest of the economy and the rest of the countries catch cold, so we are also being affected. And if we look in terms of the, what do you call it, the fiscal policies, the stimulus packages that have been introduced in many other countries, as well as the expansionary monetary policies, the reduction in terms of the benchmark rate. So would you want to comment on that, Prof?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Maya. I was actually just about to make a transition to...
All right, okay.
I have to be much more disciplined. Seeing my very old friend Tan Sri Zul in front of me, I was trying to reach out to non-economists, but thank you. Thanks of my responsibilities. Otherwise Tan Sri Zul might go away thinking that all he's doing is adding junk So let me try to deal with your question, but it actually relates to two other examples I was going to use. One is the case of Vietnam. Okay, Kerala.
Yes.
Okay? So what Kerala can do only is circumscribed by state revenue. Okay, and agricultural state, there's only so much you can. That's why there have been many papers written about the fiscal crisis of the Kerala state, you know, because it spends a lot of money on education, it spends a lot of money on health, and has got very little source of revenue. I mean, how much can you get from coconuts, growing coconuts, and so on and so forth? So there is a real problem there. And to add, to make things even worse, the central government of India has been actually, although Kerala has done far more than any other state, the numbers are actually in the article which I wrote some weeks ago. But what you find is that the government has not given them funds. They have given them the minimal amount of funds they are obliged to give, and not given commensurate with the amount of effort the Kerala is doing. So this has become a big issue in terms of federal-state relations. And you, of course, as a Sabahan, will be very conscious of some of these issues. But let me mention also the other two countries I was going to mention. And one is Vietnam. Yeah, and Vietnam has also been very, very affected. In fact, Vietnam has not had death so far, although they were one of the first to be infected, because Vietnam also had workers coming back from Wuhan and so on and so forth. They have also not had a lockdown at the national level. They have had localized lockdowns, comparable to a quarantine, if you will, around sort of Mukim-like areas. You know, if you think about Malaysian Mukims, this is where they've had lockdowns. But they have been quite fiscally conservative in the sense that they have appealed to the public to contribute money, and they have, for a relatively poor society, there have been tremendous contribution by the public to the effort. By, for example, PPE, you know, protective personal equipment, and so on. In the case of Argentina, which is the other example I was going to use in connection with the fiscal issues, Argentina has done very remarkably. The new government of Argentina only came in December last year, and without going into too much detail, Argentina has been almost the greatest example of a country which is heavily indebted because of policies adopted by governments in the late 20th century. So what has happened is that Argentina has actually done two things. Soon the government did something which was very remarkable. After winning against the previous ruling coalition party, this new government, where the President Alberto Fernandez, declared this a lockdown in Argentina, together with all the leaders of all the political parties in the country. Okay? So a few from the ruling coalition, but the vast majority are actually from other parties. But it was a display of national unity about the need for the country to unite to deal with this problem. Even before Argentina did this, I was actually calling in this country because of the 3 weeks the country lost during the political transition at the end of February and early March. I actually called for a government of national unity to try to deal with the crisis. Needless to say, it fell on deaf ears, but the point was similar. Okay, and this was even before what Argentina did. So, but the second time he united the entire political spectrum was when he announced to the rest of the world. After consulting the other political parties, he announced to the rest of the world that the priority is Argentina. The priority is the people of Argentina. It is not the people they owe money to. Okay? This is very important to emphasize because Argentina has been heavily indebted abroad since for many years. The previous government had actually renegotiated to improve the conditions for the debtors. So this actually involved reversing that. But even the previous ruling party agreed with Fernandez that these are extraordinary circumstances. So you find that all over the world, many countries take the view that this is an extraordinary situation and that it requires an approach to fiscal policy which is more comparable to a wartime economy. I don't want to push this wartime mobilization too far because it has been abused also. But I think particularly on the fiscal front, this has been important. For example, countries have issued coronavirus bonds and various other things, to fund the fiscal response. Certainly, they have gone further into debt and so on. But this is an extraordinary situation, and if you do not try to overcome with all the means available, it becomes extraordinarily difficult. It's like you're tying your hands behind your back and trying to go into a boxing match. You know, it's just impossible. So this is precisely what has been happening fiscally in different parts of the world. And if I can change a little bit and just tell you that my last example was going to be Brazil, and that's a negative example. In the case of Brazil, the president of Brazil has been fighting with all the governors of each state, because in Brazil, every state has an elected governor. He's been fighting with all the governors. He has insisted that everybody goes back to work, and the governors have refused to let the population go back to work because of the very major. He basically takes the view that this whole virus is a figment of the creation of the mass media. It's not really a problem. You might remember him as the one who was visiting President Donald Trump and came away from that. So one of the extraordinary things he has done, and this is why I'm very careful about what I mean by wartime measures. One of the extraordinary things that Jair Bolsonaro has done in Brazil has to call for a coup against his own government. Now you think, what is this guy doing? Hey, calling for a coup against his own government? It's not as stupid as it sounds, because what he wants is that when you have a coup and you have a state of emergency, the state governors can be done away with. Okay, so you force the state governors to do what or remove the state governors, and you impose a central government at the state government level. So do what Bolsonaro wants to do. In the meantime, they are opening graveyards in Brazil, and they're using bulldozers to dig graves around the clock. You know, and this is the situation. So Brazil is a negative example. It is the largest country in South America, and unfortunately, it's a very, very tragic negative example. But coming to your question, I think what we have is a situation where you do not play by the normal rules of the game. This is not an economic slowdown due to financial crisis, for example. Yeah. What happened in 2008, 2009, or before that, after the Asian financial crisis in 1998. This is a slowdown imposed by the government by imposing a lockdown, the MCO, and now the conditional MCO. So it is not, so to use a football language, it is scoring an own goal. Okay, so so the question is what, and so you find, for example, that you can have so-called wartime measures and try to strengthen the central government authority, as in Brazil, okay, or abuse it in other ways, or you can deal with it effectively by using a lockdown as a measure of last resort. So now you have a situation where you have a lockdown in many societies. The question is, how do we minimize the damage? And here we learn from Kerala, and to some extent, you take care of the most vulnerable people. And I'm very, very concerned because the conditional MCO does not take care of the most vulnerable in our society. Those who run small gerai, for example, they are not allowed to operate. It is the supermarkets which are allowed to operate, and so on. So the management is very much middle class oriented, and we are beneficiaries of it, being part of this sort of broad category of the middle class. But for the remaining 70% of our population, for the bottom 2/3 of our population, they are suffering in different ways, and especially for the urban population, because the MCO is less stringently enforced in rural areas. So these are the people who are the most vulnerable, and they might never be able to recover because they have commitments. They have commitments to the supplies they have received, but they cannot sell the products which they cannot sell. They have commitments in the sense that they have often borrowed resources. They have paid for rental for certain facilities, but they are not able to operate from the rented facilities, and so on and so forth. These people are in extremely bad shape, and they don't even fall into our categories of SMEs. They're not small, medium enterprises. They are micro enterprises. They are family enterprises very often, and they fall below our radar. So having policies for the SMEs, as important as they are, will not take care of them. And those people who are, for example, many people who were previously working for the city council and so on, the alam flora workers who clean, who do a lot of socially essential work, but are very, very poorly paid. Many of them are now daily paid or weekly paid. No work, no pay. No pay, no income. No income, no food. Okay, and they are receiving in the form of relief payments. That's why I think the Malay term relief payment is prihatin is actually much more accurate. One cannot call it a fiscal stimulus. It's not a fiscal stimulus. It's not going to stimulate the economy to be revived. And so it is very important to take the necessary measures to get the economy going as soon as possible, and to find ways and means by which many of these people can operate. That's why we have to learn from other societies. In Vietnam, in Kerala, for example, women are still selling in gerai, in markets. Their customers are not allowed to come within 2 meters of them. They have to stand or sit 2 meters away from them. And then only at the point of transaction, they say, okay, I want these vegetables and so on and so forth. At only point of transactions, you hand over, and that's the only point when you come into some kind of contact. Otherwise, you stay 2 meters away from one another. And so it is possible to take a lot of precautionary measures to prevent a resurgence of the infections without without stopping the economy. So we really need to prepare the population, and that's why it's important to have an all-of-government approach, which just is not focused only on the health ministry or the police, but also involves all the other ministries, preparing the whole of society for what you can loosely call a new normal, how we will need to interact with one another for some time to come.
Okay, Prof, we have a lot of burning questions coming in at our chat rooms, right? But I really do agree with your views in terms of taking care of those vulnerable people. I would also like to quote this one article written by Dr. Camilo Felito from IDS. He said that this economy is not like a frozen food where you can, freeze it and then defrost it anytime and expect things to go back normal and as usual, yeah. But let me also read some of the questions, yeah, posted in the chat room. I think the first one, okay. We would like to bring you back to the US government, US economy, right? We've seen that the unemployment rate has reached its, if I'm not mistaken, it's an all-time high, about 14.7%. Yeah, but some has basically stated that the US government response is quite inefficient. So what lead to basically the inefficiency of the response by the US government in your view, Prof?
To be quite honest, I have not been following the US as closely as I should, as often as it is, but rather I've been trying to draw attention to how other countries, especially developing countries, have responded
Okay.
well, as well as those which have not responded well. I think in the US we have, because of the unemployment benefits which are available, there is a fairly high level of reporting of people once they lose their jobs. And so, but it's also important to recognize that it's very easy to lose your job in the US because the prerogative is always with the employer in many situations. Very small proportion of the US labor force is actually unionized. And even those who are unionized do not necessarily have many rights. So the presumption is that the US market, labor market is freer than in other situations. And so we have fairly good numbers in the US of people who are jobless and therefore presumably lacking in income and so on and so forth. Of course, President Trump will blame the state governors for the inefficiencies which you alluded to. And the state governors, of course, will blame President Trump for many of the problems. I think it's also important to recognize that this is an election year. This is an election year, and this is important to recognize partly because we need to try to understand why the Trump administration has radically changed its position. For those of you who still remember, in the early part of January, in fact, for most of January, President Trump praising the Chinese government for its cooperation, for its willingness to share information, and so on and so forth. He was extremely appreciative of China's response. And part of the reason why he was so appreciative was because he had basically in anticipation of the election the elections, he had basically been pursuing a US-China trade war, and the Chinese agreed to an agreement in early January, which was quite favorable to the US and enabled him to come out looking very good. So this was something which Trump appreciated from the Chinese. But since then, as you know, so in the early part of this year, Trump's ratings reached an all-time high. He's doing very well, but since then, his ratings have come down terribly, and he is getting quite desperate. So obviously, his major narrative, is not appealing to those other than the faithful, the loyal ones. And this is...
He's been making quite many weird statements. I think the recent statement that he made on, we have a lot of cases because we did a lot of testing, that has been quite he's been getting, you know, like criticized based on his statement on that. Prof, if I may move to the second question.
Sure.
Hold on. Let me just look at the question. Okay, the question is quite long, yeah, but I think it refers to the situational poverty that one of the, what do you call it, educationist has basically pointed out, yeah. This particular situation would basically affect the poorest people, but not only that, even some M40s would also be facing difficulties because of losing of jobs and things like that. So in terms of long-term effect, the question asks, how would it the policies, yeah, in particularly in Malaysia. So we pull you back to Malaysia now, yeah. So how would the policy be steered in order to tackle these issues, Prof?
I think it's important for us to recognize that there's almost nobody who's unaffected by the crisis, you know, in Malaysia. There are very few people who are making a lot of money out of the crisis. Of course, we all know about the case of the mask manufacturers who initially wanted to push up the price of the mask by 150% from 80 cents to 2 ringgit. But I think that was subsequently became so outrageous that, you know, and there have been a few people undoubtedly who have profited from the crisis. But I think the very fact that there has been a general decline of economic activity has hit everybody. Some have been hit much harder than others. And you mentioned the M40. I don't really subscribe to any of these categories. They were invented by the World Bank to avoid talking about inequality. So for decades, they talked about poverty, but didn't want to talk about inequality. When they were forced to, they came up with this B40, M40, and so on. Some of my colleagues at Khazanah Research Institute have actually argued that the people who are, that probably the B20, the bottom 20% of the population are probably those who are having a really hard time, not even being able to make ends meet, if I can put it that way. Then you have what might be called an M50. That means from the 3rd decile up to the 7th decile. Okay, for the economist Rizal, don't worry. Basically, if you take away the bottom 20 and you take away the top 30, whatever, the 50% which remains is your M50, according to my colleagues. And these people have enough, but not enough to really save. Okay, so they do not have savings for a rainy day. So when you say that many of the people in the so-called M40, what your M40 is basically between the 5th decile and the 8th decile. Okay, so those people, you know, I'm not surprised at all by what you said. And we know, for example, that 82% of the people who have forced savings, yeah, EPF, okay, 82% of them will get an income when they retire, so when they stop working, which will not even put them above the poverty line. Okay, so only 18% are sort of taken care of. So I think what we are talking about is a situation where even before the crisis, many people were not really well off. And we were becoming an increasingly indebted society, okay, where you have a lot of people heavily indebted throughout their lives, okay, to make mortgage payments, to make car payments, and so on and so forth. Okay, so yes, we undoubtedly standards of living have improved. Car ownership is now the norm in Malaysian society, and most households have cars, and so on and so forth. But most households have so much debt you cannot say that they are living income. So my colleagues did this by matching the data for income with the data for expenditure. Okay. And then for the top 30%, those people are probably, depending of course where you are within the top 30%, you may have be able to save a little bit more. You may be able to afford, you know, a holiday or something like that, you know, and so on. So I think what we really need to do is to go back to the data, to go back to to have our own knowledge of our own society, rather than have these imported categories, you know. And so your question actually highlights the inadequacy of our understanding these categories which we have imported.
Yep. So if I may recap on what you mentioned on the indebted society, right? But some, what do you call it? I think MIR have basically proposed to reintroduce GST. And do you think during this time it is wise to raise taxes, given the current situation, and whether, because as we know, the fiscal stimulus package or the Prihatin package that has been introduced by the Malaysian government has basically increased the budget deficit to roughly around 6%, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. So do you think it's wise, Prof, given the current situation, that they are also considering to raise the taxes and or similar things like that?
I think that there are two ways you can begin to answer that question. One is by going back to the earlier question as to whether or not you know, you should spend beyond your means, so to speak. My view is that we are living in very extraordinary times, and the time when you unfortunately have to break any kind of budgetary rules and so on and so forth. It's not a license to be for abuse. And there are a lot of concerns now, for example, with all the political appointees to head government-linked companies and so on and so forth. There's a great deal of concern that there's going to be a lot of abuse. But leaving that aside for a moment, and coming back to your big question on taxation, my late friend, Professor Ismail Saleh, you know, he was physically blind, yeah, but he saw more than most Malaysians. And what he recognized in his PhD thesis was that income distribution after taxation was more unequal than before taxation. Okay, I need to reiterate that because it's counterintuitive. Okay, we often presume that the tax system is progressive. It is not the case. The tax system in this country is regressive, and he showed this for figures from the 60s onwards, and subsequent work by a Sarawakian economist, Professor Wee, has shown that the inequality of the taxation system has gotten worse. So the big change came with the changes in income taxation and property taxation from the middle of the 1980s. So income tax brackets all came down, and property taxes, some property taxes were even done away with. Okay, and then beginning from that time, you had the advocates of what was called VAT, value-added taxation, and there were a lot of advocates of that, mainly people associated with the IMF at that time in Malaysia. And they were very influential. They were members, they were high-level civil servants and so on and so forth who were doing this kind of advocacy. And I think what it is very important to recognize that the value-added taxation as a tax is relatively efficient as a tax, but it is a consumption tax. It is an indirect tax. And generally speaking, consumption taxes and indirect taxes tend to be regressive. And this was something Ismail Saleh showed, and Professor Wee has also showed. Now, we know then from this, the GST sought to rationalize the existing consumption taxes. And to some extent, they did. So the GST replaced the SST, which was a little bit, not exactly terribly consistent, and so the GST could be said to be more efficient, and it suddenly collected much more revenue than the SST did. But let us not forget, it is a progressive tax. Okay. Now, we know, for example, Professor Thomas Frank at Cornell, for example, has proposed how you can make consumption taxes less regressive. And so during that brief moment when I thought I had some influence on government policy after the May 2018 election, I tried to move the discussion in that direction. But unfortunately, for most politicians, it was GST or no GST. And so, we saw the end of the GST. My own view is that learning from Thomas Frank and others, and more importantly now, is Thomas Piketty, the young fiscal economist at Berkeley. They have been talking a great deal about how to reform the tax system. Now, much of the discussion is focused on Western societies, undoubtedly. But we are copying Western societies all the time, and including in matters of taxation. So there's absolutely no reason why we shouldn't be learning from them, not to simply mechanically transpose what they are proposing for Malaysian society. But this is the way we need to move our discussion forward. Unfortunately, the proposal ignores what Ismail Saleh pointed out long ago, and ignores the possibility of redesigning the taxation system in this country to make it much less regressive to begin with, and if possible, more progressive.
Right. I think we need to basically extend our session perhaps to another 15 more minutes, Prof. Yeah, because the questions keep on coming, and I also like to call upon our Back Students Council, the head of our Back Student Council, Brother Rafiq. He has quite a burning question to ask. Brother Rafiq, are you still there?
Yes, Doctor.
Yes. You may want to ask your question to Prof. Jomo.
Thank you, Dr. Maya, for the opportunity. So I would like to ask one thing to Prof. Jomo. I would like to know your thoughts on the one-day parliamentary sitting and the effects of it on Malaysia response policy to COVID-19. Because I think that Parliament is a really important tool for the government to design a policy for every person in Malaysia. Thank you, Prof.
Thank you very much, Rafiq. I think you're absolutely right. I think we have not involved the different branches of government enough. As I mentioned earlier, much of what has been done in the MCO has focused on basically the police and the health ministry. There's been very little attention given to, for example, changes which are needed in public transportation, changes which are needed at the workplace to ensure physical distancing, to ensure precautionary measures are taken at the workplace, and so on and so forth. And the question Tan Sri Zul raised about what does it mean in terms of the future of higher education, and the number of children who are basically not going to be able to go to school, and the inadequacy of relying on distance learning, especially when you're relying on Wi-Fi availability, and so many parents do not have Wi-Fi appliances and so on and so forth. So we are going to see possibly, because this epidemic is not going to go away overnight. We are going to see a very, very major challenge for all of us in all our different spheres of life. And we are not even recognize these problems. We need a public discussion. Some of the comments which Tan Sri Zul made earlier, but that kind of discussion needs to be carried on. We already have 3 distance learning institutions in Malaysia, and we have so many in the world which we can learn from. And now in the last few years, we have MOOCs, which are online courses available which can be used by all. So how do we make the best out of this terrible situation is a very important challenge. So Rafiq, coming back to your question, without consultation, without mass consultation, I cannot imagine that the public is going to get behind this. So you need that mass consultation, and Parliament offers the most legitimate means of consultation of public policy, and getting the bill through. In fact, you might remember that during the period of transition, when Tun Mahathir was the only was Prime Minister without a government, so to speak, he only wanted to do one thing. He wanted to push through the bill to fund the COVID-19 response. And this was in late February, before we knew the enormity of the challenge before us. So you can see that he wanted to have this dealt with, and unfortunately we lost some more time, and the epidemic was able to spread even further, and so on and so forth. Pointing the fingers is not going to get us very far, to say that, so-and-so was responsible for what happened with the Tabligh cluster, and so on and so forth. And we are making other mistakes, since then, and how do we get beyond this? What are the requirements, and what do we need to enable for us, for example, to get back to work, not just in approved factories with influence with the ministries, with 1 or 2 ministries, but also for ordinary people to get back to work, because they are having a tough time surviving. And if we, for example, send the wrong signals about migrant workers, and we will have a Singapore-type problem. You remember that the second wave in Singapore, in fact, it was a tsunami. It came about because they wished away the migrant workers. They are so heavily dependent on migrant workers, but they wished away the migrant workers. And they did not see the threat coming from the conditions in which migrant workers have to work and live in. So then we saw that. Now in Malaysia, the situation is even more dangerous, because we have 2/3 of the migrant workers in Malaysia are not even documented. We don't even know conditions under which they live. And they live even in more cramped conditions and in more unhealthy conditions. And the likelihood of a so-called Tabligh cluster, spreading is very great in such communities. For anybody who has ever visited these communities, you know what I'm referring to. But what has happened? What has happened is that we have learned the worst from the West. We have learned to blame the other. We are blaming the Rohingya refugees. We are blaming the migrant workers for our problems. It's the kind of thing which you expect from Trump and his followers and his imitators in Europe. But this is not something you expect from Malaysian society, which has embraced many higher values, many of which are inspired by Islam. This is bringing out the worst in us, and I think this is very, very unfortunate. So you need to have public discussion. You need to have a recognition of the challenges which we all face as a society together, and Parliament would have been a good occasion to have this kind of discussion. But we also know that this government may not feel very confident about its durability. But I'm surprised that anybody wants to take over the government at this. given the challenges which you're facing. And that's why I said what we do need is a government of national unity. And of national unity, I think we would be able to solve many of our problems and not create the conditions for abuses and so on, which will come back to haunt us later. You know, with for example, politicians using to fund their political activities and campaigns and whatnot. So we really have to do something better. We deserve better. We are capable of better, and we really need to. So what you're coming back to your question, Rafiq, we need to have that kind of openness, certainly in Parliament, because it's otherwise there's no more rule of law in this country. You know, we cast aside the institutions which we have been able to preserve, and you know, it's to the credit of the Barisan National Government that they did not when they lost the mandate in May 2018, they gave way to the new government and so on. But we cannot, you know, we it's something which we need to protect. You know, kind of accountability, and there are ways, I think, you know, and I do hope the Prime Minister Mahyudin will and our colleague at IIUM, Dato Mazuki, is obviously has his ear, and hopefully we will be able to have some good sense prevail. But it is important for these few institutions of accountability which exist in our society to be able to function. Otherwise, the alternative, I fear, is not only lack of accountability, not only abuses, but more importantly, I fear we are going to have a government.
Right. I'd like to take this opportunity to call upon Prof. Aslam. If you have anything to say or to add in, Prof, because I think we have another 10 more minutes left. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Maybe I just want to take the discussion from the last point that Jomo was talking about. Certainly, I think, you know, we've been seeing it in the last decade. Malaysia seems to be moving in the direction of a minority government. So even if we have, you know, any change, you know, it's going to be another government that is, you know, just barely making it. And therefore, this idea of a national unity government is a very interesting one. I know it's not new. I remember, I don't know, maybe even 15, 20 years ago, it was suggested. How do you think, or what should be done in order to push for this, you know, getting this national unity government? And how would that national unity government make it easier for, let's say, economic policy on development to go through? Because I think now it's always this, you know, whatever policy being proposed by one side, it's the you know, it's the job of the opposition to oppose. So how would it make it easier? And do you think it can happen in Malaysia?
I frankly am an optimist by nature. Otherwise, I would have given up long time ago. So one has to always be optimistic, always hope that things can improve and change, and so on and so forth. Yes, I think something can happen. You know that the Prime Minister's health has been in question for quite some time now, and I think the Prime Minister did what he did with a particular sense of purpose. We may disagree with his purpose and so on and so forth, but I do not believe that he did it entirely for selfish reasons. The Prime Minister and the former Prime Minister are both from the same party. The Prime Minister and the next Prime Minister to be, according to the promise of the last government, are also on talking terms. I think everybody knows, it's not a secret that Anwar Ibrahim met with the Prime Minister some weeks ago. So I think all this is important. You know, I think we need to have some conversations going, and there are, of course, many vested interests who are dead against it, who are going to do everything possible to sabotage it. So it will take people who are perhaps seen to be above the fray, you know, people seen to be people of goodwill, who may have to become facilitators, if I can put it that way, you know. And perhaps somebody like Tan Sri Zul. Tan Sri Zul has led 4 universities, you know. Obviously, there was confidence among people from different regimes in his leadership capacity and so on and so forth. But he's not. I'm not putting the weight of this entirely on his shoulders. There must be other people as well, you know, people of goodwill. I hope they are not just men, but also women of goodwill who would like to do something, save the nation, and to recognize that these are extraordinary times. Just like I said earlier, that we need to think about some wartime measures in terms of the mobilization of society, that we need to think about mobilizing all of society. We cannot fight COVID-19 if we say, oh, only PAS will be mobilized, or only Perikatan Nasional will be mobilized against this. We have to mobilize all of society. And one of the terrible things about epidemics is that they are equal opportunity infected and they're equal opportunity killers. Okay, so this is not a time to pilih bulu, you know, as you would say, you know, to be picky. You know, this is a time for the country to unite, as the Argentinians have demonstrated, and others have demonstrated as well. You know, these are extraordinary measures, I think we are going to run into problems. It's not going to be what the Americans call a cakewalk. You know, it's not going to be easy. You know, there are going to be a lot of obstacles, and the greatest obstacles will probably come from many other people around the Prime Minister himself. So it's not going to be easy. But I think if these are people of goodwill, and I do believe they are, I think we have a chance. We have a chance of creating the conditions under which you suspend the normal rules, so to speak, and you don't go for business as usual. Think about Tun Razak, you know, after May 13th. He consulted very, very widely. He consulted, you know, people like, say somebody like Syed Hussein Alatas, who was from an opposition party at that time. He led the Gerakan, which was an opposition party in those days. He was in the National Consultative Council and so on and so forth. I was recently talking to the daughter of the late Hassan Adli, who was the leader of PAS Youth and so on. This was before PAS joined the Barisan Nasional. Hassan Adli was also involved in the discussions in the National Consultative Council and so on. And so I do think that statesmen can rise to the challenge and do what is needed, but it's not going to be easy for them for the reasons which are, I'm sure, are obvious to everybody who's listening. And so what we need to do is to create, we need some extraordinary measures, some extraordinary initiatives by people of goodwill to do what is needed so that the country as a whole is better prepared the nation as a whole is better prepared to deal with the challenges which we face. Because, you know, while we are dealing with COVID-19, it doesn't mean that all the other problems we have disappeared. In some ways, some of those problems have become worse. Just look at the price of oil, which has been, and the Malaysian economy can be said to be floating on oil, both petroleum as well as palm oil. So, you know, the price of both are now, you know, are really at an all-time low. This is the time when we need to rethink food, for example. You know, we only think about food safety when our food exports are blocked from going south of the causeway. We need to think about trying to ensure that, you know, again, I'm sorry to keep on mentioning, but I was very glad that IIUM honored the late Haji Idris. He was always very, very concerned about the excessive use of toxic agrochemicals in our food, and we'd hardly pay attention to that. And then now there's greater concern about the excessive use of antibiotics for animal breeding, whether it's fish or poultry and so on. And it has already been projected that at least 10 million people will die by the middle of the century, given current trends as far as due to antibiotics. And many more people will have their responsiveness to antibiotics compromised. So if you go for surgery and the antibiotics used are not effective because you have been consuming antibiotics all the time through eating fish which are having too many antibiotics, or other animals which are having too antibiotics. So these are all problems which we need to begin to face together, you know, and we need to rise above the scoring political points and the appeals to the worst instincts of I don't even want to call it humanity, the worst instincts of mankind, you know, which is unfortunately the turn which we have seen in recent weeks with the anti-Rohingya sentiment, the anti-migrant workers sentiment, and so on and so forth.
Right. Thank you so much. Oh, no. You have covered it very well, mashallah. So I think we really run out of time. We would love to stay more with you, but I suppose we are given about 1.5 hours to conduct the session, but we have basically extended it a bit. I think throughout this, from 2:30 until now, yeah, we have learned quite a lot from you, Prof. Thank you so much. You have basically briefed us on the different experiences from different countries, starting from China, and then you also talk about South Korea, India, yeah, Vietnam, Kerala, also US, and you also come back to Malaysia and looks into the response of the policies. Then what can we learn from those countries? I think, and then it boils down to the national unity government, which is very, very, what do you call it, a very good idea. Yeah, I think most of us would support that. It's just that how are we going to basically tackle that, like what Prof. Aslam has basically highlighted. So in short, Prof, maybe I'll give you another 2 more minutes to round up or just to pass whatever very important message that you want to pass to all of the participants here.
Thank you very much, Dr. Maya, and I want to thank you and IIUM and the faculty for this opportunity once again. But I also want to emphasize that why I was so keen about having this lecture on this subject, which as I fully admit, is a subject which I'm only a recent student of. You know, I've spent much of the last 3 months, very much doing almost about COVID-19, but really focusing very much on developing countries. We look too much to the West. Look at what happened. Tan Sri Zul will know this. You know, the British approach, as you know, was to go for herd immunity. You know, and they didn't do anything, and only after the ICL study, Imperial College of London study, came out, and they showed that over 1% could die from that approach, the UK government changed itself. But and you find that in Malaysia, everybody who's involved in epidemiology and so on, everybody refers to the ICL study. We are not paying enough attention to what happened in China, what has happened in Vietnam, what has happened in Kerala, and so on. We really need to be reoriented. And the other reason why I'm very, very keen on this opportunity is precisely because there is a large thinking international community associated with IIUM. And it is important because so far, if you look at what's happening, we do not have very high levels of infection apparently in South Asia and in sub-Saharan Africa. I don't think they are exempt. I do not take the view that dark-skinned people have kind of natural immunity, which some people actually believe, okay, and so on. I think there are a variety of reasons. And one of the reasons is that there has been less passenger air travel. So you find that in many societies where there has been, which are not, it's very difficult to get to Gabon, for example, okay? But you find a very low level of infection in Gabon. But it doesn't mean that therefore you don't bother about it. You have to prepare. And this is why I think the lessons, particularly from places like Kerala and Vietnam, of relatively poorer societies become so relevant for poor societies all over the world, relatively poor societies, so that people can prepare. And there are many things which we can learn. A poor country, relatively what they call a least developed country like Bangladesh, was developed a pharmaceutical industry precisely because it had this kind of advantage. So you use this opportunity when everybody in the next 1 week will be in touch with their families, because we cannot be with our families for obvious reasons, but we will be in touch with our families to retrace the messages of taking precautionary measures. So let me conclude by wishing everybody Ramadan Kareem for the duration of the week or less than a week ahead of us, and an Eid Mubarak for the Eid when it comes. Also, please fulfill your responsibility of conveying to our loved ones what kinds of precautionary actions needed and how we need to prepare for new ways of interacting with one another as we go forward, not only in Malaysia, but also well beyond Malaysia. And this is the beauty of IIUM, where you are willing, much more open to learn from international experiences, international comparisons, and so on. So thank you very much for this opportunity.
Inshallah. Thank you, Prof. I would also like to take this opportunity to call upon Tan Sri Rector. Do you have anything to add? Is he still there? Tan Sri?
Microphone is off.
Oh, okay.
Tan Sri, your microphone is off.
Your mic, yeah.
I think whoever is the moderator has to unmute.
Okay, unmute him. Yeah.
Yes. Okay, he's okay now.
Right.
Okay, I was saying I would just like to thank Prof. Jomo for opening up so much space for discussion, and also take the point that we need to do something. As a university, I think we must do something. It doesn't matter whether there is a unity government or not. I think it is all within our means to convey information, to debates of this nature. But one point that I will take from your talk, Prof. Jomo, is what you say, the poor man's option. We have not been looking at the poor man's option. They have been with COVID virus for a long time in a different form, yet they survive. and we need to look at what sort of option they go, cut off the excesses that we've got. You talk about the indebted society. All this, I think, needs to be relooked again, so that we will really, quote unquote, if you want to talk about a new normal, there's a kind of new normal that we need to get back. And I think the university is ready for this, as long as we can understand what it is all about and move on, maybe create an example, a kind of a template where we can demonstrate what it is all about as far as unity is concerned. So I would like to thank you once again. Hopefully it's not the last time. Maybe we can call you again on other occasions. But thank you very much. Karim Mubarak, and also if I don't see you for Hari Raya, Selamat Hari Raya Aidilfitri, Maaf Zahir Batin. Thank you so much.
Right. Thank you, Tan Sri. Thank you, Prof. Jomo. Thank you, Prof. Aslam. And thanks to all of the organizing committee. I would like to take this opportunity to say, stay home, yeah, stay productive, stay healthy. And I think I just add one more to that, reflecting from Prof. Jomo, stay positive as well, yeah. So Eid Mubarak, thank you so much for participating with us. So I see you, inshallah. I see you and I see you whenever we have another session. Okay. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam.
Assalamualaikum.